All right, hello everyone. How are we doing today? So this is going to be the exam review session for exam 3 in Anatomy and Physiology 1. So this exam is just like the previous exams. So there is a 90 question multiple choice true and false lecture portion of the exam, and then there is a 21 question practical. This practical will be all on the muscles, just as a heads up. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. I'll go through 3D organ anatomy again and go through all the important muscles that we need to know. So just the chapters first off here. So chapter 8, 9, 10, and 22. So chapter 8 was the joints, 9 muscle tissues, and microscopic anatomy of muscles and how muscle contraction works. Chapter 10 then were all the muscles, and 22 is the respiratory system. So starting here with chapter 8, this was on the joints. So again, just as an aside for this exam, study techniques for this one, you want to look at your virtual labs, your quizzes, and Kahoots, and look over your workbooks. And that should be a good background for this exam, and of course, review the slides as well. But here, chapter 8 for the joints, this was a short little chapter on the joints. Just remember that not all joints permit movement. So we have the different types of joints. Some joints are freely movable, some are slightly movable, and some do not move at all. So movement of joints, and not all are movement. So we have the sutures in our brain. So sutures do not move at all. So at least when we're older, there's no movement. Then know the different types of movements around the joints. So types of movements here, that includes, flexion, extension, hyperextension is when you go beyond anatomical position. Then you have abduction, adduction. So your adduction is going towards the midline, abduction is going away from the midline, circumduction, pronation, supination, dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, etc. So make sure you understand all those movements so that if I put them in a question, you know what I'm asking, or if I'm asking for one of those as an answer. Then know the different kinds of joints. So remember, with each type of movement, there's a kind of joint that goes with it. So kind of joints include the plane joints, where you have two plane joints interacting with each other. Hinge joint is like your elbow. Best example of that. Ball and socket joint, your glenohumeral joint for your shoulder, and also your hip joint. And then you have saddle joints, like your thumb, condyloid joints, like in your fingers, and then pivot joints as well, like you have on your radius and your ulna and your atlas and your axis. So those are the main kinds of joints we talked about. And then know the classifications of joints, those kinds of joints, and classifications here. So what are some different ones called? So we have gymphosis. Remember, a gymphosis is a tooth joint. So every tooth is connected to your gums via the periodontal ligament, and that is a gymphosis joint. Synchondrosis, so a synchondro SES here, chondro. You see chondro, think cartilage. So these are cartilaginous joints. These also include the pubic symphysis. Other ones we have here are the fibrous joints. So fibrous joints are like the sutures here. So these ones are fibrous. And then, yeah, those are the main ones. So these ones also do not move. So the structure then, so different kinds of joints and classifications. The big ones are the synovial joints. So make sure you understand the breakdown of a synovial joint so you have that, let's say we have two bones here that articulate with each other. There's a synovial membrane here which secretes synovial fluid into this space so that when these two joints move, it prevents the buildup of friction. Then there's a connective tissue on the outside which holds this all together. So just a general breakdown of a synovial joint, and that synovial fluid is produced by that synovial membrane. And then around these are also likely to contain little bursa, these little balls that prevent the buildup of friction in that region, and also tendon sheaths. So if a muscle were to connect into this region, it'd be surrounded by a tendon sheath to prevent the buildup of friction there. So friction reducing structures, if you ever see tendon sheaths, or bursa. So all of those are friction reducing structures. And then, so in between the knee, then, let's say we just drew the knee right here in this cavity. Oops, let's draw it a little better here. So in this cavity, then, where the knee is, there's some ligaments that goes through there. So like there's the ACL, which is the anterior cruciate ligament, and then you have the posterior cruciate ligaments. Those two ligaments prevent hyper extension of the knee. So if one of those are torn, it's really easy to hyperextend the knee. So it's the most important support of a joint, though, is strengthening that muscle around the joint. So if you have anything torn or anything stretched in the shoulder, the first thing in all rehab is to strengthen the muscle around that joint. And then ranges of motions, if you're looking at kinds of joints and classifications and comparing that to types of movements. So which joints have the greatest range of motion? So the shoulder joint has, or the glenohumeral joint has the greatest range of motion. So it is a ball and socket, but it's not a deep ball and socket. It has that glenoid labrum, which kind of helps hold it in place, but it's very movable. Widest range of motion for your shoulder, but it still is able to pretty strong because of that glenoid labrum that's around it. All right, that is pretty much chapter 8. I'm going to take a quick sip of water here, and then we're going to go into chapter 9, which is on the muscle tissue. So chapter 8 should be a little bit more simpler. Chapter 9 is when it starts getting a little bit heavier. So let's just do this chapter. Oh, what's it doing? Stop this. Chapter 9, not P, 9 is muscle tissue and contractions. So the first part of this is understanding muscle anatomy. So understanding everything from the gross anatomy down to the microscopic anatomy, between the difference between thick and thin filaments. So thick filaments are myosin. So thick is equal to myosin. Thin is equal to actin. Remember, then these thick and thin filaments slide over each other via the sliding filament model of contraction. And then the way these thick, so let's say this is a thick filament here, and these are thin filaments, the way these thin and thick filaments slide over each other then form striations in that muscle fiber. So these different kinds of striations that can form then form little, there'd be a Z disc there as well in there. I know this is a really bad representation of this, but this is showing the representation of these thick, here are the beautiful myosin heads connected right here to this actin, and so forth. So understand, we had the A band, the Z disc, the H zone, the M line, and yeah, those four were the big ones: A band, I band, H zone, Z disc, and M line. So know all these bands. You had some matching figures to work with, and remember these bands are named from how these thick and thin filaments overlap each other. And then know that from Z, so this is the Z disc right here, and this would be another one right here. There's another one. So from Z disc to Z disc, that is termed a sarcomere. A sarcomere is an individual contractual unit within a single muscle fiber. So if you're looking at a muscle tissue, you see all these striations in it, and it's from all these sarcomeres lining up in the differencing amounts of thick versus thin filaments that are lining up in that region. And then for the different words we use when talking about a muscle cell, remember muscle cells have a unique shape. So instead of cytoplasm, it's called the sarcolemma. Instead of the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, it's called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And remember, the sarcoplasmic reticulum stores calcium. Just like the smooth ER does, the sarcoplasmic reticulum, or the SR, is responsible for calcium storage, which is essential for muscle contraction. And then there's the sarcoplasm. Did I say that's the cytoplasm? Don't remember if I said that. But then more components of the muscle cell. There are the T tubules, which then help get calcium release through the whole fiber. So if you're looking at the cross section of a muscle fiber, you have all these myofibrils lined up through, and that the T tubules help it so the ones in the middle here also contract, and it's not just calcium being released from the surrounding out here or wherever that sarcoplasmic reticulum is. So the T tubules actually pushes the sarcolemma in so that we get a calcium release inside the muscle cell. Oh, that was a bad idea to erase, but it's gone now. So yeah, that's a big one. Other parts of the muscle cell, you have the myoglobin. So myoglobin, if you know what hemoglobin is the protein that carries oxygen in our bloods. Myoglobin stores oxygen in our muscles for a fast source of oxygen when we need it. And then understand the connective tissue that surrounds muscle fibers. So, well, a muscle cell, and then the fascicles, and then the actual muscle itself. So the endomysium surrounds the cell, the perimysium surrounds a fascicle, and the epimysium surrounds the muscle. And then, of course, there's the muscle contraction. So understand the process leading, muscle contraction. Understand the process leading to a muscle contraction and then the entire event of a muscle contraction. So, in short, the action potential. Now, I'm not going to write all this out. We're just going to talk it out in words. The action potential reaches the neuromuscular junction at the synapse. So when that action potential reaches the synapse, calcium channels come in to the presynaptic, to the terminal end of the synapse. When calcium comes in, it causes vesicles filled with neurotransmitter to be released. That neurotransmitter is called acetylcholine, or ACH. Acetylcholine then goes through the synaptic cleft, binds to ACH receptors. ACH receptors then allow sodium to come in. So sodium then slowly comes in, causes end plate depolarization. End plate depolarization then leads to a graded potential, which eventually causes an action potential in the sarcolemma, which again is the cell membrane of the muscle fiber. That sarcolemma causes voltage gated sodium channels to open. So voltage-gated sodium channels cause a rush of sodium in. That's then fires the whole action potential down the sarcolemma, and then boom. So that's the electrical signal running through the sarcolemma. That entire muscle cell is now activated. When that happens, so this action potential opens voltage-gated calcium channels along those T tubules around those triads there next to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So calcium then comes out. Calcium then binds to troponin. I guess I am writing it out. Yeah, it's because this is important. Calcium binds to troponin. So remember in a actin filament. So actin is two rings of actin that twist around each other in a way. So this is supposed to be a bread tie, twisting around each other. And then there are these little binding sites in here. However, that's blocking these binding sites is this protein called tropomyosin. So in orange here, this is called tropomyosin. And then let's do in green here, there's two little, let's change the size on this now. So then this is troponin. All right, so the two T's, calcium comes in. Go back to white here. Calcium comes in, binds to troponin. Right now, so if we had a thick filament right down here with myosin head sticking out, those cannot bind to actin. Because these myosin filaments are blocking these binding sites. So this wants to bind to that. However, it can't. But when calcium comes in, binds to troponin, it actually moves tropomyosin. Calcium binds troponin, moves, which then moves tropomyosin out of the way, and that opens up these little binding sites here. Myosin can then bind, goes through a power stroke, So a power stroke is when, so right here at this point, there's an ADP and a phosphate attached to this myosin head. When it binds, it ratchets it down. If I had my cam on right now, you'd see my fist moving down and causing a contraction. Now, when this is in this state right here, it needs ATP. So ATP then comes in to release it, and then it resets the whole system so it can go through it again. So then causes a power stroke. Then ATP resets it, and it can go just as long as calcium is there and holding it all together. So if ATP wasn't present, let's say this organism died, there'd be no removing those myosin heads from actin. So there's no stopping contraction. That just stays stuck there. So that process is called rigor mortis. So rigor mortis is when it can't detach, and the animal's legs are sticking up. Also, let's say there's a autoimmune disease called myasthenia gravis. Myasthenia gravis is where these acetylcholine receptors are broken down. So if there's no acetylcholine receptors, you don't get anything to the right of this arrow. So again, that causes severe muscle atrophy. So myasthenia gravis is that. I think it's an autoimmune disorder. So yeah, that's a big one to know. And also, so you should be able to go through that and write all the steps out to a muscle contraction. What else do we need to know here? Not all skeletal muscles contract at the same time. So cardiac and smooth muscles, they usually contract together due to gap junctions, but skeletal muscle does not. It has different motor units that go down there and contract differentially depending on the load that's needed to be moved. So what determines how strong a muscle is? So the main factor that determines the power of a muscle is the number of muscle fibers available for contraction. So the number of muscle fibers available for contraction. Then there's different types of muscle movement. So there's isometric versus isotonic. So make sure you know those. So isotonic, eccentric movement, and so forth. Isometric, there's no movement. That's like carrying your groceries in, but that doesn't mean you're not applying a force. So then a muscle twitch is when one muscle fiber contracts, and you're analyzing the contraction of one muscle fiber. One muscle fiber is not a muscle. Just looking at one particular muscle fiber. And then a sustained contraction without relaxation and capable of producing a movement is then called a tetanic contraction. So tetanus is a full-on contraction, but you can still produce a movement during that until you get fatigue. And then know the differences between contractions in skeletal and smooth muscle. So the main differences are that there's no troponin in smooth muscle. I'll write that because it's important. No troponin in smooth. So remember what troponin was for. It was to move the tropomyosin away from the myosin binding sites for muscle contraction. So if there's no troponin, the activation process is slightly different here. Calcium actually binds to another protein called calmodulin. Calmodulin then activates the myosin heads and initiates the binding process. So slightly different in smooth muscles. Another important thing to remember here is that muscles can only push. Muscles can never pull. Also, tendons, not ligaments, are what connect muscle to bone. Ligaments are bone to bone. Tendons are muscle to bone. So important thing to remember in this section. And then we also talked about the different energy sources for ATP. Like the fastest source was that creatine phosphate. So what that did was when your muscle used ATP, so your muscle took ATP, converted it to ADP, and it wanted it to get this conversion back. What it did was there is this another molecule here called creatine phosphate. So let's just draw a C with a phosphate on it. So that's creatine. That would actually act on this and then cause a conversion back to ATP. And then from this, we'd get just creatine coming off. So it would remove that phosphate group and then add it to the ATP, which is kind of cool. So that one only lasts a couple seconds after vigorous exercise. So if you go anaerobic then, So aerobic exercise is when oxygen is present. Anaerobic exercise is when there's no oxygen present. And when you go anaerobic, pyruvic acid, instead of going to the mitochondria during aerobic respiration, pyruvic acid gets converted to lactic acid, which then goes back to pyruvic acid or goes to the liver and could become glucose again as well. Last little bit here on muscle tissue. So EPOC, the excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. So EPOC consumption represents the difference between the amount of oxygen needed for totally aerobic muscle activity and the amount actually used. So the amount of oxygen you need to breathe in after a workout. Okay, now we get to chapter 10, which is the muscles. Everyone's favorite chapter here. So some tips. We talked about the tips for knowing the muscles. Know the types of muscle functions. So whether they are an antagonist, synergist, agonist, or fixator. So they're different functions and how they work together. So one muscle would be an agonist of a certain movement and an antagonist of another movement, and maybe a synergist for a third movement. Know the types of muscle fibers. So functions, fiber types. So by fiber types, what I mean are, so the orbicularis oris being a circular muscle. So going around the oris, not oculi. Oris is going around the mouth. It's a circular direction of muscle fascicles. Pectoralis major, that's a convergent muscle. So pectoralis major originates on the sternum and the clavicle, and then inserts over here on the intertubercular sulcus of the humerus, or it converges down to that one point. And then the rectus femoris, one of the strong muscles in your quadriceps femoris. All those fibers actually go into the central tendon coming down. So there would be a central tendon right here. And that's what makes the rectus femoris so strong too, is because there's a lot more fibers, they're short fibers, and there's a high abundance. And that's what contributes to muscle strength. So remember, the main factor that determines muscle power is the number of muscle fibers available for contraction. So in these bipennate muscles here, there's a lot of fibers available for contraction. Also know the basic principles of a lever system. So it depends, let's say you have a different lever here, you have a fulcrum, you have your effort, and then you have your load at the end. So it depends on where that fulcrum is, where your effort is, and where that load is. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on what's a class 1, class 2, class 3, what's a mechanical advantage, mechanical disadvantage, what's a speed lever. Just know that it all differs based on this position of the fulcrum, the effort, and the load applied for the lever systems. And then remember, know all the muscles from the images I told you in your workbook. Now, when you're trying to remember the muscles, remember the muscle tells you a lot. The name of the muscle tells you a lot about the muscle. Triceps brachii means there are 3 origins, and it's in the brachial region. The sternocleidomastoid tells you inserts on the mastoid process, and also the sternum, and originates on the sternum and the clavicle. The sits muscles, some of those include, I'll get over those when I go over the 3D organum, but know what the sits muscles are, but the subscapularis, the infraspinatus, the teres minor, and the supraspinatus, or sits. So those are all the muscles of your shoulder joint. The most powerful muscle in the body, even though it is forward muscle, it's still considered the most powerful muscle in your body, is your quadriceps femoris. Remember, that's made of the rectus femoris here, and then it has the vastus medialis, the vastus, well, that's be the vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, and then underneath all this is the vastus intermedius. Those muscles together are the strongest muscle in your body, and a lot of it has to do with the direction of these fibers and being a bipennate muscle. And remember, this quadriceps, these are the prime movers of knee extension. If you're ever wondering the movement a muscle makes, think about pulling the fibers in the direction they run and how it would move that joint. So if the quads are the prime movers of knee extension, the antagonist would then be the hamstrings. On your inner thigh, you have your adductors, If you had a pulled groin, you would be pulling your adductors. Then coming up after that, remember when you're breathing, respiratory system is the next chapter, but when you're breathing, then the diaphragm and the external intercostals. Well, your diaphragm is the prime mover of inspiration, and then your synergist with that assist it are your external intercostals. It's all about making your thoracic cage larger. Should I go through respiratory system or go through organon now? Let's hop to organon anatomy now. So let's go through some of the major muscles of the body here. So the ones that are important you might see again, the occipitofrontalis, or some people might call this the frontal belly, and so forth. Over here you have the temporalis. Right here, the one that allows you to smile. This one's a zygomaticus major. Remember, if there's ever a major, there's a minor. So right there's major and the minor. Minor just means it's smaller. Back here's the buccinator. So the buccinator is the one that allows for sucking. Right here then is the masseter. So masseter connects, so it originates on the zygomatic arch here and inserts onto the mandible. And this one allows for chewing. Right here is the orbicularis oculi, and then the orbicularis oris is what goes around the mouth. On the chin there's the mentalis muscle. I think these are all the important ones of the head. That was from that picture. Going down here, this is the platysma. Let's hide this because this is hidden on all the models. So let's remove that, and then we have my favorite muscle here, the sternocleidoid mastoid, going up here from the mastoid process down here to the sternum and the clavicle. Deep within here, we have all the hyo ones that are connecting to the hyoid. And then back here, you have your large trapezius, or your traps. Now, if it's on the practical, traps is not the correct answer. Trapezius is the correct answer. Now, let's hide this so we can see the other important ones back here. Back here, this is the splenus capitis. Then you have all your semispinalis capitis ones back here. All these little muscles going down through here. And then moving down, we have, right there's the supraspinatus. So those are rotator cuff muscles. Right here, your rhomboid major, so it looks like a rhombus, so pushed over square. And then right here's the rhomboid minor. And right there's the infraspinatus. So infraspinatus, supraspinatus, and then if we go in deep inside the clavicle, there is the subscapularis, and right here is the teres minor. So teres major does not connect up to the rotator cuff region. So these are the big ones on the back here. Moving around to the shoulder now, here's our good old deltoid muscle. So this is a multi-pennant muscle that then converges onto one part. All right, moving down the arm then. So on the back of the arm, we have the triceps. There's the lateral and long head, and then there's the middle head in there as well. If we hide that, right there's the medial head. On the front here, we then have the biceps. So remember, biceps has two heads to it as well, hence biceps. Underneath that, we then have the brachialis. Moving down then to the forearm. So forearm is complex. First muscle, main muscle here is the brachioradialis. That's the one that kind of wraps down around the inner arm right here. You can feel it on the outside, the medial side of your arm. So it connects up here and then comes down through. It's that little bump you have there if you turn your arm the correct direction. There's a little strap-like muscle that goes down there for pronation. If you think about contracting that one, it allows you to pronate. Around the inner arm here, the flexor carpi radialis, just extending down here to the carpes. And then the palmaris longus is one you can use to orient yourself. Palmaris longus extends to all these tendons into the palm. And then the flexor digitorum then goes out to all the digits. And then flexor carpi ulnaris. So all these are flexors down here, if you notice. These are all flexing. And then the flexor carpi ulnaris runs along the ulna. And then when we go around here, if we go right to the other side, we get to the flexi carpi ulnaris again, and then we get to the extensor carpi ulnaris, and then the extensor digiti minimi. Minimi means pinky, or little toe, so it's going to the pinky and little toe. Then the extensor digitorum is another one I use to orient myself, just like the palmaris longus. So going to the all the digits. Now there are some deep ones here, so pollicis means it goes to the thumb. And then as we go around here, other ones we'd see on the models are the extensor carpi radialis longus, going down the radius, and the so there's a brevis and a longus, two of those. One's a longer one, one's a shorter one, and then we get back to the brachioradialis. So I would choose the easier ones from this region. If I were to label them on a practical, I wouldn't get too rude with that. All right, back here we have the back muscle. This is latissimus dorsi. Back here then, you have all your serratus muscles. So the serratus posterior and serratus anterior that we'll see when we go on the front here. Then you have your erector spinae muscles, those three muscles back there that then form that erector spinae. We go to the front then. We have your pectoralis major on your front of your chest. It's your pectoralis major, not your pecs. And then underneath then we have the pectoralis minor, and here is where we see those external intercostals here. And then here is the serratus anterior. It looks like a serrated knife as it goes down through. Then for your abdominal muscles, not shown here, I guess, is the rectus abdominis, which is supposed to be going down the middle. But here are your external obliques. Oh, there it is. It's shown under that one. Okay, so some models are good and bad. So yeah, external obliques, and all these muscles are named based on the direction their fibers go. So external obliques are right there. Then you have your internal obliques, and if you look at the directions, they're running in different angles to each other, and this is what gives your abdominal region strength. I would hide these ones, and you have your rectus abdominis right there, and then your transverse abdominis showing the fibers running transversely right there. Right there's your six-pack. Moving down here, so the big muscle back here, everyone knows this one is the gluteus maximus. It's a pretty easy one. You hide this one, you have the gluteus medius right there, and then if there's a maximus, a medius right there is the minimus. Piriformis is all deep hip muscle. These are a little too deep for me to label on the practical, but they are there. You can't forget about them. Right here then, let's actually start with the quad. Up here at the quad. Up here we have the tensor fascia latae that connects into the IT band, or the iliotibial band that runs down the side of the leg there. All right, now the front here is the rectus femoris, and you can see these fibers in the directions they run here. Then you have the sartorius muscle. That's the strap-like muscle. Besides the rectus femoris, you have the vastus medialis on the medial side, the vastus lateralis on that side. Then if we would hide the rectus femoris here, we'd have the vastus intermedius underneath. Moving around, adductor longus, might be able to see that one on the practical, but you can definitely see the gracilis right here. That's the one on the inner thigh for your adductors. And then if we go all the way around here and look deep inside there, there's the adductor magnus. And then we have the semimembranosus. Semimembranosus is more membrane compared to this, and it's more medial than the semitendinosus, which is attached to a long tendon at the bottom. So that's one way to remember the difference between semimembranosus and semitendinosus. And then on the back, don't confuse this with the biceps brachii. This is the biceps femoris that has happened. So that's moving down the leg now. Think I'm getting them all. Oh, there's the psoas major as well. Psoas major is the filet mignon in a steak, if you're wondering. And then moving down, we get to the lower leg here. We have first the tibialis anterior, both sides here. So it's anterior, forward side of the tibia. Going around the leg on the medial side here, the extensor digitorum longus is the one going down to every digit. So if you remember the hand, the leg comes together as well. And then you have the fibularis, which runs along the fibula and is the long version. So the fibularis longus runs down the length of the fibula compared to the fibularis brevis, which is a short one at the bottom then. And then we move around, we have the soleus, which is supposed to look like a fish. It's a flounder type of fish. And then the gastrocnemius, which is the major calf muscle back there. So that's most of them. Then you also have a flexor digitorum longus on the back side. Those are the major muscles. I know I went through them pretty quickly, but it should be a good summary to help you understand them a little better. All the ones I just talked about right there would be fair game for ones I could label on the practical. So make sure you study everything I just talked about, and also the ones on that sheet, and look at the pictures you have of the models. Most important part to all this, because you have to label them based on the models we went over in class. All right, let's go back to the notes here, and then we are on the last chapter. So the last chapter here is, chapter 22, which is respiratory system. So, like all these chapters, first thing you need to know is the anatomy. If you don't know the anatomy, you don't know how to talk it. You don't know how to read the questions and so forth. So know the gross anatomy of the respiratory system. So the pharynx, the larynx, the main bronchus, the trachea, the carina, the alveoli, the terminal bronchioles, first degree, second degree, and so forth. Know the different amounts of lobes in each lung. So the left lung has the heart pointing towards it. So it has 2 lobes. The right lung then has 3 lobes. When you breathe in your nasal cavity, you have the nasal concha, which are there to enhance the turbulence and increase the mucosal surface area exposed to the air to heat it up. And then as you're breathing in, you have your larynx, which has your vocal folds. So you have true vocal cords and false vocal cords. And what happened is that you can then have those false vocal cords form a sphincter, and that during certain things like the Valsalva maneuver, those vocal folds can act as a sphincter. Then along the trachea, there are these C-shaped cartilaginous rings made of hyaline cartilage. So those are there to prevent your trachea from collapsing upon itself. Helps maintain the openness of the trachea. And then so at the ends of your your bronchioles here, you have the alveoli, which are little grape-like sacs. So these are the main sites of gas exchange. Now remember, within these alveoli, we have type 1 alveolar cells and type 2 alveolar cells. Type 1 alveolar cells are simple squamous tissue, and that's where most of the gas transport happens. But the type 2 ones are very important. They produce a fluid called surfactant. So type 2 produce surfactant. Now, surfactant is really important because it helps prevent alveolar collapse by interfering with the cohesiveness of water. So these alveoli are just simple squamous tissue. If we allowed the water in there, the cohesiveness of water would actually cause them to contract upon themselves and not be able to fill efficiently with oxygen. And then understand how breathing works. So understand the pressure differences of when air moves into the lungs or when air moves out of the lungs. So that's understanding the terms atmospheric pressure, intrapulmonary pressure, and intrapolar pressure. So when you expand your thoracic cage and then move your diaphragm down, you open up that region, and actually the pressure is then lower on the inside. So air rushes in. And then when you exhale, you make that thoracic cage smaller, and then the pressure outside is less, so then the air rushes out. And then understand what tidal volume is and the different parts of breathing. So tidal volume is the normal respiration you have coming in and out. So normally exchanged during normal breathing. And then when you go to different environments, sometimes you have to have acclimatization to those environments. So you understand the basics of altitude acclimatization. So that's when your body isn't getting enough oxygen and it has to make more red blood cells for adequate distribution. So it actually activates EPO. When you're low on oxygen, it actually causes an event known as hypoxia. So hypoxia is when you don't have enough oxygen and your blood then releases this hypoxia inducible factor, and then that hypoxia inducible factor then causes EPO or erythropoietin production, which then causes red blood cell formation at altitudes. Now, when you're breathing, if you hold your breath, CO2 begins to build up, and then your respiratory control centers and what controls your normal breathing are located in your medulla oblongata and your pons. Now, what happens is that they actually sense the CO2 building up, and then when that CO2 builds up, they activate breathing. So no matter how long or how hard you try to hold your breath, your medulla oblongata and your pons will take over and force you to breathe. So those are the major control centers, and the strongest stimulus for breathing in a healthy person is CO2. And then we also talked about ventilation, perfusion, coupling. The ventilation perfusion coupling is when your breathing rate is matched with the blood flow over your alveoli. You don't want the blood moving too fast. You don't want it moving too slow. You want to have adequate gas exchange. So it matches breathing with blood flow, and it couples them because it matches them. Because we want to have adequate gas exchange. We don't want to have too less or too little gas exchange there. And then finally, understand some of the diseases of the respiratory system. So know what tuberculosis, pneumonia, and emphysema are. So for example, emphysema is when the walls of the alveoli are destroyed, and that produces abnormally large air spaces that then remains filled with air during exhalation. And then remember what pneumonia and tuberculosis are as well. Both those are infections. So yeah, that is a little summary review of everything we're going to need to know on this upcoming exam. My recording software is giving me an alert that some frames were skipped, so I hope this works. If not, I will record it again, but it should be good enough to help you guys get through this. But if you have any questions, feel free to email me. So remember, joints, muscle tissue, muscle contractions, that's the more physiology chapter. A lot of it is just anatomy this time. And then understanding all the muscles, and then of course the respiratory system. But I'm sure you all will do great, and I will see you all later. Remember, if you have any questions, just let me know. All right, hope you have a great day, and bye-bye.